So Darwin published his famous work in 1859. And what happened after this? We have to remember Darwin was an introvert, very frail, he was often sick. So he left a lot of the fighting and the spreading of this new gospel of his theory of evolution to others. So one person that became really instrumental in this fight was Thomas Huxley, also sometimes called Darwin's bulldog. And soon after the publication of The Origin of the Species, there was a meeting in Oxford, a series of lectures, where especially the church was trying to debate these ideas of evolution and ridicule Darwin's idea. And Huxley rose to the challenge. Here is a quote or a description of what happened in that meeting in 1860, which was really a fundamental turning point for the acceptance of the theory. So Isabella Sidgwick, a few years later, would write this: I was happy enough to be present on the memorable occasion at Oxford when Mr. Huxley bearded Bishop Wilberforce. There were so many of us that were eager to hear that we had to adjourn to the great library of the museum. I can still hear the American accents of Dr. Draper's opening address when he asked, "Are we a fortitious conquerors of atoms?" And his discourse I seem to remember somewhat dry. Then the bishop rose, and in a light, scoffing tone, florid, and he assured us there was nothing in the idea of evolution. Rock pigeons were what rock pigeons had always been. Then, turning to his antagonist with a smiling insolence, he begged to know, was it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed his descent from a monkey? On this Mr. Huxley slowly and deliberately arose. A slight, tall figure, stern and pale, very quiet and very grave. He stood before us and spoke those tremendous words. Words which no one seems sure of now, nor I think could remember just after they were spoken, for their meaning took away our breath, though it left us in no doubt as to what it was. He was not ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. No one doubted his meaning, and the effect was tremendous. One lady fainted and had to carry it out. I, for one, jumped out of my seat, and when in the evening we met at Dr. Daubney's, everyone was eager to congratulate the hero of the day. I remember that some naive person wished it could come over again, and Mr. Huxley, with the look on his face of the victor who feels the cost of his victory, put us aside, saying, "Once in a lifetime is enough, if not too much." Hooker also later in his biography wrote, "The famous Oxford meeting of 1860 was of no small importance in Huxley's career. It was not merely that he helped to save a great cause from being stifled under misrepresentation and ridicule, that he helped to extort for it a fair hearing. It was now that he first made himself known in popular estimation as a dangerous adversary in debate, a personal force in the world of science which could not be neglected. From this moment he entered the front fighting line in the most exposed quarter of the field." So Huxley was really important for spreading the theory of evolution. Over on the continent, there was another scientist, Ernst Haeckel, who was a gifted artist and a botanist and zoologist. He became very, very famous for his work on evolution, and he was equally important for spreading the ideas on the continent. So he was sometimes called Darwin's dachshund. But he also, and this is something that we will come back in a bit, he also became a strong follower of what later would be called the eugenic movement. So he was one of the proponents that advocated that the theory should be applied to humans and should be used to improve, quote unquote, the race, as it was called back then. But So far, Darwin had only written on animals. The question of men, quote unquote, was still open to be discussed. And he only had a little quote right at the end of On the Origin of Species, where he referred to the question of whether humans would also be descendant from animals. And it was not till 1871 that he would return to this question in his famous The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. This was a very controversial book for a number of reasons. It also set off a controversy between Darwin and Wallace. Both of them, they remained friends after Wallace returned in 1862. He was virtual nobody when he left, but because of the reading of his paper together with Darwin at the famous meeting of the Linnean Society, he had access to a league of intellectuals that was previously not available to him. So he became famous through his association with Darwin. So Darwin also petitioned on behalf of Wallace to get him some money, because Wallace continued to be relatively poor. So Darwin tried to help Wallace where he could. But at the same time, the publication of this book started to sour at least the intellectual relationship between the two scientists. And what Darwin was really trying to work out was, how could you explain the display, for example, in lots of birds like this, the peacock's feathers. How could you explain these amazing ornaments in terms of natural selection? Because if you think about it, this would just, like call the attention of any predator. So a peacock probably would be more likely to be eaten, so would be less likely to survive if this particular peacock had all these, like amazing displays that would be very difficult to hide. So there was a big problem for Darwin to solve. And he thought it would be possible to propose a separate mechanism. So he proposed the mechanism of sexual selection. Here's a quote from his final chapter in the book. Sexual selection depends on the success of certain individuals over others of the same sex in relation to the propagation of the species, whilst natural selection depends on the success of both sexes at all ages in relation to the general conditions of life. The sexual struggle is of two kinds. In the one, it is between individuals of the same sex, generally the males, in order to drive away or kill their rivals, the females remaining passive. Whilst in the other, the struggle is likewise between the individuals of the same sex in order to excite or charm those of the opposite sex, generally the females, which no longer remain passive but select the more agreeable partners. This latter kind of selection is very closely analogous to that which man unintentionally yet effectually brings to bear on his domesticated productions, when he preserves during a long period the most pleasing or useful individuals without any wish to modify the breed. So Darwin here sets up a separate mechanism of selection, and this is one of the debates that still goes on today, whether in actuality sexual selection is a truly different type of selection force, or whether it could be subsumed under kind of a broadened concept of natural selection. But this is one of those debates that even today has not been properly solved. But more importantly, in this book, he also made some very strong claims about humans. So on one hand, he goes out at great length to claim that all humans are of the same race, so we are all created equally. But he also cannot escape his upper class English upbringing, which kind of forces him to create some kind of natural justification for the class system. And with that, for example, he writes, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of men will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, I removed the quote here, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between men in a more civilized state, as we may hope even then the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So as you can see here, Darwin made some very racist remarks here about a natural order of different groups of humans. And this is something that Wallace absolutely does not agree with. Wallace challenges Darwin on this, and he argues that you cannot apply natural selection to humans. And Darwin at some stage basically writes this quote, I paraphrase here, "You murdered our child." So Wallace was very adamant, coming from a very humble background. He objected to the idea that you can apply natural selection theories in this way to humans. So for him, there was no way that natural selection can, for example, explain arts or culture, music, etc., whereas for Darwin, it was all an example of sexual selection. Wallace also became a spiritualist, so some people have argued that he, in effect, started the creative design movement. Because he rejected the Darwinian application to humans and some of the excesses of social Darwinism that would soon emerge, he also became very engaged in social activism. He was a great advocate for women's rights. So this is another example where Wallace and Darwin differed quite dramatically, because Darwin was of the opinion that women should not engage, for example, in research. He probably did not think that women were of lower intellect, although there is some writing that seems to indicate this. And so he did not think that women would be fit to be researchers. Wallace, on the other hand, was a great defender of women's rights, so he was petitioning for women to get the right to vote, etc., etc. So Wallace was really like becoming a more social activist than a researcher later in life. At the same time, though, Wallace lived longer than Darwin, so he also kind of changed some of the surviving ideas of, for example, sexual selection. So some people have argued that after Darwin died, people started interpreting sexual selection through a lens that Alfred Wallace used in his later writings. And Wallace in particular also started to really spread the gospel in terms of Darwinism. During his lifetime, it was still known as the Darwin-Wallace theory, but in his own writing, he often preferred to refer to his own theory as a version of a Darwinist theory. So here is really, like two perspectives and two different applications of the same kind of ideas, one by Darwin, one by Wallace. But we also have to quickly come back to Darwin's family, and specifically we have to talk about Francis Galton. He was Darwin's cousin, and Galton was part of the inner circle that would have access to all the writings that Darwin did from the 1840s onwards. So Galton was informed of all the developments that Darwin went through, and it strongly shaped his own views. Galton was a very smart individual. He developed the correlation coefficient. He developed, for example, the twin design that we use today to understand, for example, whether certain psychological characteristics are genetic or not. And he also devised, like other things like the weather map. He came up with the first weather map that we routinely see on the news every day. And he started thinking about how can you apply these mechanisms that Darwin was talking about from 1842, 1844 onwards to psychological characteristics. And he wrote a book in 1869 called Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into its laws and consequences. He used the twin design, or like the careful analysis of families, to make very strong arguments about what essentially is genetic inheritance. And so he laid the foundations for an argument that there are differences between individuals that are due to genetics. And this then culminated in a book called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development in 1883, where he proposed the idea of eugenics. Eugenics, so the idea that you can improve, quote unquote, a race by selective breeding, is something that has been around for some time before Galton, but he really put a framework around it that would allow people to apply Darwinian ideas, or ideas inspired by Darwin, and systematically apply them to humans. So he was, it's probably a little bit of an irony of history again. It seems that his wife was very had a lot of health problems, so they could not have children, and that really concerned Galton, and he was concerned about how it would be possible to preserve the superior individuals within British society, English society. So again, you see, there's an upper class notion that came into the theorizing around natural selection. And so it was Galton that most strongly pushed for an application of Darwinian ideas, or ideas inspired by Darwin, to humans, specifically the idea that it would be important to prohibit some groups of individuals within a society to procreate or have kids, and other groups in society, typically the upper class, should be encouraged to have kids. And we also quickly have to mention Herbert Spencer. Spencer was a philosopher. He was also a biologist. He came up with his own version of an evolutionary theory, very strongly influenced by Lamarck actually. And it was him who first came up with the term survival of the fittest. And it was Wallace who later suggested that Darwin should also use that term. And Darwin actually, I think in the 5th or 6th edition of Origin of the Species, he actually started using that term. But it was Spencer who claimed Darwinian ideas and then created this movement of social Darwinism. So here we start to get a sense that Darwin was implicit in his reasoning about the superiority of certain groups of individuals over others, but it was specifically Galton and Spencer that then systematically took that idea and started applying it more widely and popularizing it through the eugenics movement and social Darwinism. But it's important also to be very conscious of the fact that the way they applied it was actually more Lamarckian. So the Spencer and Galton, in the way they started applying some of these ideas, they actually went away from Darwin's arguments and Darwin's theory and started using more Lamarckian arguments again, specifically this kind of linear progression, that humans would evolve to higher forms to more sophisticated forms, which is something that Darwin initially did not use when he talked about natural selection. Natural selection for him was a random process, and it was not necessarily be geared towards more sophistication, more complexity. It was really this Lamarckian idea that both Galton and Spencer resurrected and then applied to humans. So Darwin died in 1882. Wallace died a few years later at the turn of the 20th century, and Darwin wanted to be buried in Kent, but there was a petition to have him buried at Westminster, so in the end he was laid to rest right next to his mentor and person that inspired him to go on the Beagle voyage, or one of the individuals that inspired him to go on the Beagle voyage, Herschel. And it is kind of ironic that Emma, his wife, was always worried about that his theorizing would separate them at death. And it was his popularity actually that separated them at death, because Darwin was buried in Westminster, and his wife eventually was buried in the village where they used to live in Kent. On the other hand, Wallace was against, or people petitioned to have him buried right next to Darwin, but his wife Annie was adamant that his last wish was to be buried in Dorset, and that's where both Wallace and his wife Annie were eventually buried. So this is the story of Darwin and Wallace, and this is the story of how Darwin's and Wallace's theory put together a diverse set of ideas to propose a scientific notion of evolution that would be around today. But in the next session we will see how the idea was maybe not as strong, and there were some diversions still on the way.